All I can say is that on this earth there are pestilences and there are victims, and one must refuse to be on the side of the pestilence. Imagine that one day your entire world collapsed. You are thrust out of your comfortable everyday life and thrown into an existence of chaos and death. Your loved ones are in peril. You don't know what the next morning will bring. And every single belief you hold about life, your future, and justice itself is called into question. I am talking about a disaster, World War III, an epidemic, or a famine. A situation that truly tests the limits of human endurance and suffering. In Albert Camus' criminally underrated novel The Plague, he tackles this formidable topic. Here, he portrays how people might react in a time of unprecedented panic, and what this can tell us about our own existential issues. Get ready to learn why you are never as safe as you think you are, what diseases can teach us about life, and how some people, paradoxically, find a state of disaster preferable to everyday existence. I feel the need to give a bit of a disclaimer. This is genuinely one of the most disturbing stories I have ever read, and while I'm very excited to talk about it, it does leave a bit of a hole in the heart, so be warned. I also won't be able to cover every aspect of the novel here, so I do encourage you to read it for yourself. It is well worth it. But before we get into that, I want to take a brief moment to thank today's very kind sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning platform with classes on various different topics. You can find anything from painting skills to party tricks to website design. I finished the previous class I was taking on interior design, and it actually helped me pick out my bookshelf and my lamp, so I was very happy with that. I've now moved on to attempting to bring up my cooking skills because I still eat like a student. And luckily, Skillshare doesn't just have one class on this, it has a whole series of classes that I can use to take me from my current hopeless state to somebody who's reasonably competent. Skillshare is a long-term sponsor of the channel because I've just really enjoyed using them. I've taken classes in massage and touch typing and video editing, and I feel like I've picked up loads of these little skills and hobbies that just make life that bit richer. The first 500 people to use my link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so give it a click, check it out. And thank you, my dear viewer, for watching this interlude the whole way through. 1. Denial and Delusion. The Plague, as its name suggests, follows a series of characters as they deal with an outbreak of bubonic plague in the town of Oran in French Algeria. We have Ryu, a doctor, Taru, something of a philosopher, a man of private means, Rambert, a visiting journalist, and a few others. The novel opens by emphasizing just how ordinary the town of Oran is. Its people are described as broadly unremarkable. Camus outlines the routines of the everyday citizens, how they work, see family and friends, go to the beach, relax, drink, and all sorts. He takes pains to emphasize how there is nothing special about either them or the settlement that they call their home. But at the same time, it is this very ordinariness, this very mundanity, that lulls the town into a false sense of security. The first sign that something is amiss is that all of the rats in Oran begin to die. Their corpses fill up the streets as they fall afoul of some mysterious illness. No one is quite sure how to react, and it becomes the subject of much gossip. However, people do not see this as a sign of some impending disaster. Even as the rodent bodies pile higher, it is seen more as a curiosity or an annoyance than a sign of worse things to come. It does annoy the managers of local hotels and fills people with a sense of unease, but beyond that, the rats are just dealt with in the spirit of everyone's routine. The town resists noticing what might come. The early stages of the book are largely dominated by this mood. Something will happen which signals the onset of the plague, either the dead rats or the first few human deaths or the classic symptoms of the plague turning up in Dr. Ryu's patients. But the first reaction of almost everyone is complete denial. The citizens of the town simply cannot believe that their habits, their lives could be disrupted. After all, this was not Paris. This was not the world of changing history or of calamities and revolutions. This was Oran, the most mundane little town you could think of, miles away from the centers of power. What could possibly happen here? This attitude continues even when it is clear the plague is reaching maturity. The authorities dilly and dally and for a long time will not even admit that there is a problem, much to Ryu's dismay. People pin their hopes on the idea that it will just go away of its own accord, hopefully very shortly. They fall back on the familiar and comforting thought that it could not happen here. The idea that the same disease which once wiped out a third of Europe was at their doorstep is just too horrifying to contemplate. So they simply did not contemplate it. They stuck ever stronger to their routines, as if they were superstitions that would keep the fates at bay. Or, as Camus puts it, the plague would come to an end because it was unthinkable. And in presenting events this way, Camus makes a far larger point than simply about plagues or infections. As will become clear over the course of the video, the overriding feeling of the entire novel is helplessness. The people of Oran are at the mercy of something that cannot be reasoned or bargained with, and threatens to cut through everything they hold dear without the slightest exertion. Under such circumstances, what can they be expected to do but guard their state of ignorant bliss? Who can blame them? The alternative would just be losing hope one day earlier. Camus wrote this novella during the Second World War, where twice in 30 years the young of Europe had been sent to die in their millions. Yet in each case, people made denials right up to the last second. Even Camus himself hoped that France would not need to get involved in World War II. There, as in Oran, people carried on with their lives, oblivious and denying, hoping their habits would protect them from the oncoming storm. But, in many ways, this describes our situation as well. Not just in the sense that our own age will have its problems and international crises, but more because the existence of events like the plague in Oran or the world wars betrays a terrifying fact. We are only ever one disaster away from our entire lives being upended. By describing our habits as normal and speaking of normality, we have already made a mistake. We assume a safety in our lives that simply is not there. And this is the first of Camus' rather depressing propositions in The Plague. Our existence is never as stable as we think. Throughout religious and spiritual traditions, we are given ideals of stability and immutability. The idea of eternal heaven, or of unbroken peace in the state of nirvana, or just the ancient Jewish notion of an endless sleep. This idea even pervades our modern legends of well-being. We are told that mindfulness will allow us to bear the struggles of life with an unchanging inner calm, or that we can eventually reach a level of material success where we rise above the tribulations of existence. But for Camus, these are all comforting illusions to avoid the inherent unpredictability of life. It is one thing to say that we know this, but it is quite another to internalize and act upon it. For Camus, we can do what we like, pursue whatever philosophies we please, but when push comes to shove, the world is always going to be more powerful than us. And when the factors align just right, our lives will be turned upside down. A parent will die, or worse, a child, or you'll suddenly lose everything and have to start from scratch. Your lover will leave you, you'll be shut up inside your home for a year, or your house will be destroyed by a fire. You'll get a debilitating illness, and all those plans for the future will disintegrate, carried away by the uncaring winds of fate. Because we find this idea unbearable, we shut it out and wrap ourselves in the lie of constancy, just like the people of Oran, who cling to their routines and their denial while death himself is knocking on their door. Of course, for the people of Oran, this illusion was shattered in swift and brutal fashion. When the plague could no longer be denied, it was reacted to. And here, Camus embarks on, in my opinion, an unparalleled analysis of the different ways people try to cope when their lives are falling apart in front of them. 2. The grief of disaster. Much of the middle sections of the plague concern people's emotional state once the epidemic is in full swing and the authorities have placed the entire town in quarantine. No one goes in or out of Oran. Families are torn apart. Lovers spend long months without one another. It is all eerily familiar. And Camus presents the various ways different citizens of Oran cope with the grief, fear, and loneliness of living through such an event. First of all, the nursing of false hope continues well into the plague's occupation of the town. The citizens are convinced that it will be over by the end of summer, and then that it'll be over by mid-autumn. They are optimistic that the authorities will be lenient with the restrictions. Surely the depth of their own particular suffering will be recognized, and they will be granted special exemption to let a loved one back into the city, or to leave it themselves. The newspapers begin to publish any sign that the plague will soon be gone. And over the next 100 or so pages, we gradually see this hope die away. We are told that people slowly stop predicting when the plague might end. They become adjusted to their new, empty reality, and the pain of missing their loved ones begins to lose its sting. As Camus puts it, They had adapted themselves to the very conditions of the plague, all the more potent for its mediocrity. It is left as an open question whether this is preferable to their previous condition. Now they have given up, they are spared the pendulum swing that takes them from hope to despair and back to hope. But at the same time, we are told that this robs them of their passion, begins to waste away their emotions. Whereas before they were filled with rebellious spirit, now they are described as despondent, like a dog that's been punished by its owner. Is this resignation any better than the sharper pain of disappointment? Or does it just mean the inhabitants have given up on life itself? After this point, people's reactions diverge wildly. Some give in to hedonism, recognizing that if tomorrow is not given, then today is their only option. The idea of delaying their joy ceases to make sense if they could die by morning. Others fall into a continual present, where their life no longer seems all that significant. They wander around with blank expressions, unable to imbue their feelings with meaning without the promise that the sun will rise the next day. Others fall into fear, suspecting their own neighbours and keeping everyone at a distance, retreating into loneliness and personal sorrow. Others still feel a strange sense of camaraderie in the shared suffering that temporarily united all of Oran. The second notable response people have to the plague is to try to make sense of it, both at a descriptive and a normative level. We are told that there is a special plague newspaper that is being released despite the paper shortages. This documents the statistics behind the plague, where it is spreading, and everything else a citizen could want to know about their microbial foe. And people scramble to get copies. This is despite the fact that they can't do anything with this information. It is just morbid curiosity. They want to know all about the threat, even if they are powerless to stop it. Perhaps they think if they just knew enough, they would be safe. It is like studying the theology of a malevolent god. Maybe, like the tricksters in folk legends, they could learn to outsmart it. Of course, none of the citizens of Oran can actually do this, but it still keeps them coming back for more, like the 20th century version of doom-scrollers. But, perhaps more than descriptive knowledge, the people of Oran inevitably ask not just how this is happening, but why it is happening. What do they have to believe in order for this epidemic to not be the chaos of an absurd universe manifesting in front of their eyes, but instead something more just, or at least more sensible? The starkest example of this is in the sermon of Father Panlu, who initially describes the plague as a trial and punishment from God. He says that the only way to keep yourself safe from it is to live without sin and trust in divine mercy. At first, many people are satisfied with this information and even follow it, but eventually, the cracks begin to show. When Father Panlu watches a child die in agony from the plague, having done everything he could to save him, Dr. Ryu shouts at him, saying, "That child, anyhow, was innocent, and you know it as well as I do." I love this moment because Camus is pointing out that sometimes attempting to make sense of the tragedies of life can not just be unsatisfying, but outright cruel. Say we were to agree with Leibniz and argue that this is the best of all possible worlds, then it follows that anything, no matter how awful or unconscionable it appears on its face, is nonetheless justified by something. Everything becomes necessary and there is no room for moral error. God does not play dice. And that child had to die. This eventually becomes Panlu's unintuitive conclusion. He accepts that he cannot think of a reason why God would allow any of this to happen, yet he says his faith will bear the humiliation of this ordeal. He uses that word, humiliation, advisedly. Even as he himself is dying of the plague, he professes he has to go beyond humility, beyond resignation and trusting God's plan. He must prostrate himself before the altar of his faith and accept the blows that rain down on him, without flinching or attempting to regain his dignity. The strangest reaction of all, however, is of a man named Cottard. Before the plague, Cottard was melancholic and attempted to end his own life. He is a quiet and withdrawn man and is terrified of the authorities for reasons we are not privy to. Cottard is also the only person who seems to positively enjoy the plague. Whereas he found normalcy unbearable, it is in a crisis that he thrives. Suddenly, the fear and loneliness that he felt was shared with everyone around him, and the monotony of his previous existence was disrupted. It is a bit like when something goes wrong and a little part of yourself is thrilled just because something of undeniable significance has happened. Cottard embraces his plague life. He becomes a smuggler despite not really needing to. He makes friends and eventually is a real man about town. However, as soon as the plague begins to abate, Cotard becomes unstable. At the close of the book, he almost goes mad and begins shooting at some revelers who are celebrating the end of the epidemic. The last we see of Cotard, he is beaten and dragged away by the police. The addition of Cotard is a true bit of genius by Camus. It would be so easy to just depict the suffering of a crisis. But Camus recognizes that for some people, the normality and routine that so many cling to is itself an unbearable reality. And for them, a crisis can be an escape. In a situation where all of the assumptions of habit are suspended, these people feel suddenly free, as if they can breathe fresh air again. It reminds us that some people's lives are already so plague-stricken that the invisible hand of chaos sparks not despair or dread, but excitement and release. Of course, when normalcy returns, they have their hope ripped away again, and they crawl back to their private plague houses. These reactions so far are all understandable and fascinating, but Camus explores another contrasting response to disaster, one that draws attention to the potential brilliance and kindness that dwells in the hearts of ordinary men. 3. The banality of goodness. In the wake of the Second World War, the question on the lips of every psychologist, philosopher, and sociologist in the Western world was, how could seemingly normal people be persuaded to commit such awful atrocities and still live with themselves? And the legendary philosopher Hannah Arendt gave possibly the most famous analysis of this with her concept of the banality of evil. Her full idea is complicated and nuanced, but the overall theme is quite straightforward. People will tend to go along with whatever there is significant social pressure to do, particularly if they are advised to do so by an authority figure, and even if it does an awful lot of harm or goes against their personal values. In effect, when push comes to shove, people will take the path of social least resistance. Since Arendt posed this idea, it has been used to examine all manner of sins, from atrocities to crime waves, but there is potentially a flip side of this idea. Essentially, the banality of evil argues that people are very malleable, and in the right circumstances, with the right social pressures, they will take the path that intuitively makes sense to them at the time, regardless of how evil it seems. But with this idea comes an inverse of Arendt's original proposal. Just as an ordinary person might transform into a villain in certain circumstances, they might also be made a saint. And this idea is captured perfectly in the volunteer teams of Camus' plague-ridden town. Once it is clear the plague is overwhelming Oran, Tarou comes to Ryu with a suggestion: to recruit volunteers to aid the doctors in their efforts to combat the plague. Among the primary crew we follow are Tarou himself, Rambert the journalist, Father Panlou, and an administrator named Grand. We are explicitly told that most of these people are not particularly exceptional in and of themselves. They have not displayed any great deeds of bravery before this point, and they come from all walks of life. Nonetheless, they each go into mortal danger day after day in order to help. When they are asked why, each of them gives a slightly different answer, but many of them boil down to the same thought: it just makes sense to do this. Paradoxically, it is almost the path of least resistance, decisionally speaking. And for many, but not all of them, their motivations do not stretch beyond the banal. In The Plague, Camus repeatedly shows his fundamental faith that humanity is willing to make great sacrifices and endure extreme hardship to help others, if they are just placed in the right situation and given the right encouragement. Again, it is the extreme reverse of the notion that anyone could commit an atrocity if they were just told to do so in the right way. Camus says that the most heroic character in The Plague is Grand. Grand has no particular reasoning for joining the volunteer squad and potentially forfeiting his life for the sake of his community. He is a terribly lonely and unhappy figure who spends his days mourning the departure of his long-lost lover. Over and over again, he is painted as totally unremarkable, a cog in the town's administrative machine. He is described as unattractive, unassuming, unconfident, and basically devoid of higher aspirations and goals. He plans to write a novel, yet he can't get past the first sentence. But at the same time, he performs his work with the volunteers diligently. He forgoes rest, joy, and health in order to be of service. And yet, when he is asked why, he does not have a principled answer. It is like it would never make sense to him to do anything else. He is good in a way that is totally and refreshingly mundane. Grand ties into Camus' general critique of the cultural idea of a hero. Normally reserved for the exceptional or the special, Camus instead specifically applies it to the ordinary. People who, in a crisis, rise to the occasion despite its seeming hopelessness and go out of their way to aid others, even when, on the surface, there is not a special thing about them. It is the polar opposite of the demigod Greek hero or the Renaissance noble protagonist. Considering he wrote this during the Second World War, it is touching that Camus managed to see the kindness and generosity of mankind amongst all that pain. This sort of banal goodness is also found in Dr. Ryu himself. Ryu probably puts himself at risk more than any other person in the novel. He is constantly visiting patients, working in the hospital, and organizing evacuations and quarantines. And yet, the motivations of Ryu are also not particularly philosophical or sophisticated. They can be summed up in a single sentence. He is a doctor. He fights sickness. It is his duty and his job. It doesn't even cross Ryu's mind that he would do anything differently. His heroism just follows from his character and the situation, totally free from a grand narrative or the idea that he has been chosen. Then there is Taru. He has a slightly different motivation from the others because he's got something of a checkered past. When he was younger, he began a lifelong quest to make the world a better place. He joined revolutionary organizations, fought, struggled, and sacrificed for them. And yet, each time, he found that he had brought about the death and suffering of others. His volunteering is at least partly to make amends, to give back the lives he stole, and to truly do his part to alleviate the sufferings of the world. It is Taru who starts the volunteer squads totally unprompted, in order to seek his redemption and to help others. Here, Camus touches on a theme that will become increasingly prominent in his later works. How can man find redemption in a world without God? And Taru represents a tentative suggestion in the active love and aid of one another. Taru himself dies of plague, having never fully assuaged his conscience. And we are left with the open question. In giving his life to save others, did Taru redeem himself? Finally, we have the journalist, Rambert. Initially, Rambert does everything he can to escape the quarantine and return home to his wife. He is heartbroken at being separated from her, with no way to reach out and no means to know how she is. He even makes arrangements to be smuggled out of the city, and is willing to pay a lot of money to do so. He says goodbye to the other characters, and is prepared to leave that very night. But at the last moment, he changes his tune. He realizes he could not return to his love as a coward, someone who shirked their duty and gave in to their own needs in a time of crisis. He informs everyone that plans have changed, and now he is here to stay. Again, there is this theme of everyday goodness, everyday saintliness. Rambert is not from Oran. This is not his home, and he has no particular ties here. Furthermore, he is given every chance to escape, and it makes perfect sense for him to do so. And yet he returns to help, knowing that if he dies of plague, he will never see his wife again. In an age of cynicism, Camus puts forward a deeply admirable idea. What if, when a disaster hits, we see not only the worst of us, but the best of us too? To quote one of the final lines of the novel, "There are more things to admire in men than to despise." When the plague begins to abate, Ryu has deep personal doubts about whether he or the volunteer squad achieved anything at all. But one thing is certain. These ordinary people had their characters tested to the limits, and they were not found wanting. And savour that note of optimism, because it is at the very end of the novel, when the worst of the plague is over, that Camus delivers his final, devastating point. 4. Temporary peace. At the close of the novel, light emerges. The plague cases gradually begin to decrease, the deaths start to fade away, and the quarantine is eventually lifted. People file out into the streets to celebrate. Rambert is reunited with his wife, and all seems to be going back to normal. There are parties, revels, rejoicing around every corner. Interestingly, almost immediately, people try their best to forget the plague. Camus says it recedes into the background of their minds, almost as if it were never real. They want to believe it was just an anomaly, a blip in their otherwise ordinary existence. In effect, they wish to return to their blissful unawareness of the inherent instability of life. And many of them succeed in this endeavor, at least partly. They say that the nightmare is over, and that Oran will be as it once was. But a few cannot do this. In the final days of the epidemic, Taru dies of plague in Ryu's apartment, snatched away at the last second, and making victory turn to ash in Ryu's mouth. He is painfully aware of what everyone else attempts to deny, that this physical plague was just one disaster amongst the many that will occur in their lives. Their current feeling of safety is an illusion. The same illusion that granted them respite when a loved one had died or when some previous crisis had befallen their house. They are returning to their old habits, their old routines, as if they are now secure, that nothing like this will ever happen again. Ryu knows this is not true. The sufferings and tribulations of life are never truly over, and they occur without warning, out of the randomness of an absurd universe, and sometimes at scales that seem nonsensical. Just because there is no reason for something bad to happen now does not mean that the bad will not come. It just means we won't see it coming. The people of Oran have fallen right back to the first step of a new cycle. They are in denial of any future disaster, and as a result, they will be just as surprised when the next slice of absurdity is scratching at their window. And who can blame them? They are powerless to stop it. But Ryu cannot do this. He has seen too much to go back to how he was before, and he reveals himself as the narrator of the novel. He writes this chronicle of the plague as a testament to all who have suffered, so that they, at the very least, will not be forgotten, and that we will not drift back into the illusory peace we crave. He does not want us to let those who writhed in pain on hospital beds before dying with rattling rib cages to be consigned to mere statistics. He wants the plague to be a living monument to what they lost and what we lose in the sufferings of life, and to not try and make sense of it or justify it, but just see it for what it is. And so with Ryu, as with Camus. For him, we are all either in plagues or in the temporary lull between plagues. There is no end to the unjustifiable chaos of the world that sometimes brings the heights of joy and sometimes the depths of despair, seemingly without warning or discernment. Camus wants us to stare this fact in the face and try not to blink. While other works, like The Myth of Sisyphus or The Stranger, deal with lives that are robbed of meaning by monotony or tedium, The Plague asks us to imagine Sisyphus happy in another way. Here, we focus not just on the pointlessness of Sisyphus's struggle, but also its pains. We imagine his aching shoulders, the burning in his thighs, and the parched air scorching his throat. We feel his plagues each time he rolls the boulder up the hill, and the brief respites as it comes crashing down to the bottom. Knowing that this is his eternity, and also our lives, how do we react? Do we make like Father Panlu, trying to justify the world no matter how unintuitive the consequences become? Do we try to escape our torment through deeds and love like Tarou or Rambert? Do we stand unjudging, simply documenting, struggling, and doing our part, just like Dr. Ryu? For Camus, this question will be posed to each of us at some point. There will come a day where this manifestation of the absurd knocks on our door, suffering defying explanation. And it is up to each of us to figure out how to bear it. Of course, Camus explores many of these themes further in his brilliant work, The Fall, which you can learn about right here. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.